So I hope the connection will hold through, right, through the interaction. Is this is the audio and video coming through okay? Okay, cool. So thanks for that. I'm very happy to be sharing some of this work as well as some information on COVID-19 with you all. Maybe the format we discussed is that I can begin by giving a brief overview of the pandemic, especially how it has been panning out in India. And then Neha will be asking a few questions, and I'm very happy to have a wider interaction with you all. Just one disclaimer at the beginning is that COVID-19, and for that matter, any disease, has multiple dimensions. For example, tuberculosis. So one big dimension would be the causative agent of tuberculosis, the bacterial origin, and the microscopic work, the intracellular work, and that kind of biological and biomedical aspects. And the second, much huger mountain is the social aspects of any disease. And as with any disease, with COVID too, there are so many aspects to this illness and the effects it has had on all of us as a society. So I'm not an expert on all these aspects. So there are a few things that I know due to my training and from my experience. So I will only be able to talk with confidence on those aspects. So that's just one rider there. So to begin with, I think, as you all must have already realized very well, it's an unprecedented kind of a pandemic. Globally, there is more than 3 million cases already, with over 200,000 deaths due to COVID-19 and climbing. In India, we are close to 1,000 deaths, not there yet. But there are over 7,000 recoveries. So, and that's very important too, to notice amidst all the dark news of many deaths. We must realize that a large proportion of people completely recover with almost nil medical interventions. That proportion varies. It depends a lot on the age, nutritional, and various other characteristics of the population. If you take, for example, the Italian population, one of the reasons, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why Italy did have a very severe outbreak is also because it has a huge elderly population when compared to, for example, India, where the population is still young. Our average lifespan of an Indian is more than a decade less than you would see in, say, in Italy or in Sweden or any of the European countries. So we are a younger population, and the disease affects the weak, the vulnerable, nutritionally, socially, and physically vulnerable more severely. And that's an important biomedical as well as a social dimension we need to keep in mind while we discuss COVID-19. Yeah. Yes, so there are more than 7,000 recoveries. There are still the COVID-19 India dashboard, many of you must already be familiar with it, tracks something like 21,573 active infections currently, yeah, as of now. But what is interesting in the Indian scenario, so the outbreak in India was detected somewhere in mid-March. And I think many of you will remember the moment when the Prime Minister announced what he called the Janata curfew at the time, around 20th or 19th or 20th of March. And then subsequently, it's been a lockdown. So and for some, it's a big question, is the lockdown working? Was it needed at all? And if you see the latest evidence coming in from high quality work in medical journals like the Lancet, it's very clear. If you look only for medical evidence on whether the lockdown is working or not, it is working. There's no doubt. Lockdown has known to be flattening the curve. That's another phrase you must have heard a lot, which basically means that the disease is not catching on or climbing as steeply as it might have if this centrally imposed measure were not taken. But we must not also be too quick to attribute every dimension of the Indian scenario And by the Indian scenario, what I mean is that the BBC today's BBC carries an article with inputs from widely known doctors like Siddhartha Mukherjee, who's written this autobiography of cancer. It's a slight tangent, but it's a very beautiful medical humanities book by Siddhartha Mukherjee, a doctor writing an autobiography of cancer. So Siddhartha Mukherjee and many others who are talking about how the Indian mortality numbers are so low. Yeah. And of course, very quickly people are saying, "Wow, it's the lockdown and the way we did things in India." So that's not entirely the case. Lot of people would caution that India is also a young population. The amount of testing we are doing is much lesser than many other countries are doing. So are we detecting all the infections or not is a big question. And most importantly, are we missing deaths? And it would not be a surprise or shock to me that our systems are not robust enough to be able to detect mortalities. And again, here the social dimension, more so mortalities in the margins of our society, mortalities in tribal and remote forested and other areas, mortalities among homeless, among various migrant populations, among the poor. So we don't know our civil register, our births and death systems are not good enough to be able to so confidently say that this is the entire number of deaths that we are capturing. So that's a bit on the. I mean, I had some notes here on, for example, symptoms and measures of the disease and things like that. I think there is a lot of that information out there, so I will not go over the specifics. Maybe among the medical aspects, one thing I can highlight is that even now there is a lot of information that is still coming in about COVID-19. So if someone, if one person says he or she is an expert on the disease, I would suggest that you do not consider that, because there is still so much coming in. For example, we are in the last few weeks, it's begun emerging that COVID-19 is not only a pneumonia. Initial reports, if you look at the World Health Organization, which announced this as a public health emergency somewhere in January, I think it was in 4th January, WHO put out its first tweet, I think, and a report where it said disease, a new pneumonia with no deaths is being reported in Wuhan Municipal Health Corporation on 4th January, WHO says. But now what is emerging is that the disease has multiple organ manifestations, and kidneys, for example, are heavily involved. Neurological involvement, you must have heard symptoms such as lack of taste, lack of smell. Many of these are coming from the involvement of the central nervous system. Various other manifestations like stroke and other things are being reported. So on the medical aspects as well, there is a lot of work happening. There's a lot of work happening on the treatment aspects. The best of experts, I'm not an expert on that, the best of experts predict that the earliest possible treatment can only emerge somewhere in the early parts of next year. And very optimistic estimates say that we might have a vaccine which might work towards the later part of this year. Human trials of vaccine have begun. So some new therapies are being tried. These are all experimental procedures that are still being tried. Many heads of state have jumped the gun and either announced too optimistic closure to the pandemic, or even misleading facts, like the President of United States, and in his style, the kind of damage he did by sharing misinformation about various therapeutics. What else? Yeah, I don't know whether it's useful to go through all the medical aspects in greater detail. We can, depending on your interest, we can develop that a bit more. There are maybe two concluding themes, Neha. If you give me a few minutes more, I can do that. Or would you like me to?
No, please continue.
Two themes. One is what do we do when we have this kind of a? So I'm coming from a public health background. So what do we do in public health? in public health, we look at populations as opposed to individuals. So I'm trained as a medical doctor. You don't have to be a medical doctor to be in public health. Public health is you could say it's a synthesis of multiple disciplines that allow professionals trained in this discipline to undertake measures that work on populations as opposed to individuals. And I think this fine difference is very important, because we imagine the immediate thing when we say, oh, a new disease is typically the response has been to rush to doctors. And the more charismatic doctors you have cardiothoracic surgeons, you have urologists, etc., advising high-level governments on what needs to be done. So one thing I'd like to highlight is that that would not be the best approach. The best approach is to involve public health professionals. And one thing we are trained in is to try and understand the effects of interventions on populations. And this is very important, because populations do not behave, do not respond the same way as individuals do. A society, for example, is not an addition of all the individuals, so there's a whole complex kind of behavior that populations manifest, and it's very important to look at this pandemic from a public health point of view. And from a public health perspective, there's basically only two things we can do. We can detect more, or we can decrease the transmission. Improved detection, contain the transmission. So improved detection is, of course, heavily dependent on how good your systems are. And that's where there is a big problem, because increasingly over the last few decades, we have diluted the importance of public financing and public systems. Systems that are financed and accountable to the entire population, as opposed to services which are based on payments at the point of service delivery, which is typically how the private sector operates. So if you see a pandemic like COVID-19, it completely exposes the failure of a privately operated health service, because we all get affected by the pandemic, whether you have the best doctor advising you who is on your payroll or not is immaterial. The question is, do you have a public system that is working for everyone and not for some people? And that's the biggest test of such a pandemic. And I hope when we are on the other side of this pandemic, and that will happen. So despite all the grave news, this will go, and it will eventually come down. I hope we will realize that investments in public systems is what is needed to ensure that we are not in the same place. And the second theme, which I'll conclude with, is a quotation. I don't know how many of you have heard of this quotation. It's from a doctor called Hutchison, Robert Hutchison. And part of the quotation I will read out. It says, and it comes in the first page of all final year medical textbooks, something that's very apt for now. It says, "From making the cure of a disease more grievous than the endurance of the same, good Lord, deliver us." So I think why I would like to bring this up is that the lockdown is, in some sense, was our population level cure. It was like that medicine that the country had to pop in to get rid of the infection. But the lockdown has not had uniform effects on the population. The effects of the lockdown have been distributed very unfairly. In fact, the worse off you are with respect to your vulnerability, the more severe burden you bear of the lockdown, whereas the better off you are, the more well-nourished, better your income. If you're able to work from home, you have a nice boss and a nice work environment, the less you have to bear the burden of this lockdown. And that's something that we need to keep in mind while we think through this pandemic. Yeah, sorry, I'm done with the initial piece.
Okay, so we'll open it up for questions now. Anyone who has questions could send them over to the host. I have a couple of questions to start with. So, I mean, you spoke about how we're not actually testing enough, but how far has the disease penetrated into rural areas, and also if you could talk about the kind of distress caused to the rural public healthcare delivery system.
Sure. Let's take the first question on how far has the disease gone. And I think this is very, very important because we are already now talking of partial exit, how to exit the lockdown and things like that. Predominantly, rural India has been spared of the direct infection. But as you must imagine, most of the people in cities who are stranded far away from their homes are all from other parts of rural India. So in some sense, the rural India may not be infected, but it is heavily affected already. So there are many, I live in a very small community here in southern Karnataka. It's a very small village. Maybe we have about few hundreds of households. And there are already so many people here in my village who are extremely anxious about their kith and kin who are stranded in very unfamiliar conditions elsewhere, who have not been able to return. So certainly rural India is already affected, not only from the kith and kin. Many people are, as you must have seen on social media, farmers are heavily affected. And like I said, the poorer you are, the greater the effect this lockdown has had. The economic effects has been staggering. In fact, it's very it's so bizarre actually, because I think today I don't know the veracity of these statements, but some of the really big corporations apparently have even seen their wealth grow. Whereas on the other hand, if you have poor rural families who have been severely economically affected by the lockdown. Second aspect is the nutrition. So I think governments are doing a commendable job in distributing grain and etc. Many NGOs are doing relief work. Azim Premji group, for example, and many others. I just named them because they came up in one conversation today morning. But the question is, you cannot many of the tribal and rural communities cannot depend on cereal alone. So it's extremely difficult to organize vegetables. It's extremely difficult to organize eggs and various other nutritious foods. So if you have small pockets of very malnourished communities, you need really special consideration in these times. If the lockdown was so prolonged, I can imagine a week, 2 weeks of lockdown. It's now been such a long lockdown for many communities. It's really staggering. And finally, the effects on essential healthcare has been quite severe. People with, for example, people on treatment for epilepsy, diabetes, pregnant women, people with long-term conditions like stroke and terminally ill, various kind of chronic care conditions. People with chronic care conditions are suffering through the lockdown and are finding it difficult to reach a point of care and are often not finding the care needed because of the lockdown. So there is no doubt that rural India is already affected, if not directly infected. And now, if the there's no running away. I have compared earlier the lockdown to a kind of a blanket that as children in games we would do, where if you're hiding, so you pretend that you put over this blanket and then the monster will go away. Lockdown is loosely comparable to that, except that we just can't be under lockdown while the monster goes away. You need to also be simultaneously strengthening your basic health system to ensure that once you start decreasing the intensity of the lockdown, you're prepared for the very likely increase in cases that will happen. So I think we are going to get to a stage where rural India will also get infected in the coming weeks to months. And our preparedness is, I can't comment on the entire country's preparedness, but from what I know, I think we could have done better in being prepared.
Okay, so there's another question here that someone has sent in, and it talks about in terms of like the public health system. So, what is the difference between systems in the urban and the rural in terms of robustness, and how are they reacting differently?
Yeah, there is a big difference. The very big difference that is stark is the more urbanized, the more private sector. Very crudely, I'm putting it. Yeah. So and when I say private sector, it ranges from something like Narayana Hridayalaya or Apollo, which is like a corporate healthcare, to an unlicensed uncle who is sitting with whatever. He's not certified. He's not. He or she is whatever. I mean, typically it's a he. And who is very popular and is dispensing medicine. So the private sector in India is very unregulated and it's very vast. So one thing is that in urban areas you have a huge private sector, and second thing is that in rural areas you have a huge health workforce called the ASHAs, community health workers, which are not very robust in urban areas. You don't have good number of community health workers in urban areas. Am I still audible?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Fine. In terms of mounting a response, ideally, actually, rural areas are typically better prepared, normally speaking, in terms of doing outbreak surveillance and response and things like that. This epidemic has clearly caught us unawares, and in urban areas we are much less prepared, I would say, to be able to respond. Take for example municipal health corporations. Cities are run by not municipal health corporations, by the municipal corporations. Cities are run by municipal corporations, and municipal corporations have very limited investment in health services. In Bangalore, for example, it's the Brihat Bengaluru municipal corporation, and you have in Mumbai, and you have in Delhi and various other places, and these are not typically well prepared for disease surveillance, for quick response and things like that. I think they're doing a tremendous job. They're learning. We're all learning on the job. This epidemic has not given us, any of us, time in terms of how to be better prepared. But in that sense, urban areas, I would imagine, are more complex to mount a response to outbreaks.
Okay. So there's another question which says, in the United States, there has been a push towards single-payer health insurance run entirely by the government without linkages to employment and no pre-existing conditions. So in that context, how relevant or irrelevant is Ayushman Bharat in these times? And what should the government do to change going forward?
So I hope that we all realize, like I said earlier, the grave importance of publicly financing our healthcare and health services. And I think, be it the single payer system that some in the US are trying to push for, or be it efforts at what the WHO calls universal health coverage, is, I think, the way forward. There's no doubt about that. Now, coming to Ayushman Bharat has heavily leaned on private sector for delivering various secondary and tertiary care procedures. So basically, one part of Ayushman Bharat, there's also a huge part of Ayushman Bharat which has to do with health and wellness centers and primary health care and things like that. I'll come to that. But the bigger piece on hospitalization, Ayushman Bharat provides a system where the government can pay for people to undergo essential procedures, surgeries, and treatments in private hospitals. On one hand, it is welcome, because critics have argued that why. Many people have argued that why should we do private sector? The government health services should perform, etc. But others have argued that it's important that while some of us are benefiting from high quality care in private sector, why should everyone not benefit that? Why is it that we create a health system which is for the poor it is a government, and the better off who can purchase private care, go to their own hospitals. So it's too much far beyond the scope of this conversation, but there is a lot to be said about the way forward in Ayushman Bharat. And there is pros and cons on each way. I would argue that as a short term, purchasing care from the private sector is important because there is an urgent need. Today, we need to ensure everyone gets the same standard of care, equitable care for everyone. So that can be done through purchasing private sector care for those who can't pay from the private sector. But that is a short-term solution. I think the long-term solution is that we need to eventually go towards high-quality government health care, where all district hospitals, primary health care centers, taluka hospitals, block hospitals are run by government, are with salaried doctors, nurses, and health workers with good quality salaries, motivated health workforce, and well-regulated, healthcare run and provided by the government is what I would push for in the going forwards. And COVID-19 really emphasizes that, because to be able to bring the huge and diverse private sector on board in responding to the pandemic is an exercise on its own, as many city corporations are realizing. So our laboratories are private, our pharmacies are private, our hospitals are private. It's really a disaster to be able to coordinate response in such pandemics. So maybe I'll stop at that. That's my piece on Ayushman Bharat.
Okay, so there's another question that's come in where it says that the alarming reality is that there are a lot of gains made in essential health services like nutrition, immunization, family planning. How do we preserve these gains? Because this lockdown situation is probably going to be a reality that we live in for a long time. Are we looking at different modalities for service delivery? Is that how the system will have to adapt?
I don't know whether it is possible to be under lockdown too long. I'm not a fan of of continuing lockdown. Certainly not at the centralized scale at which we are operating. I think we have to communitize this phenomenon of a lockdown. Communitize in the sense that we need to have them in a much smaller scale. We need to be able to decentralize the response to this epidemic by more and more panchayats, villages, and local government taking the lead in containment measures. See, lockdown is basically a containment measure. It is to ensure that an outbreak which has occurred in one point does not spread too far and impact the whole country. The evidence, why did we do a nationwide lockdown? Merely because we do not have the ability to mount a precise containment in specific zones. Yeah. So if we had that ability, we did not need a nationwide lockdown. Why would it? I mean, at the time when the lockdown was announced, the epidemic probably was not yet widespread in the country. So why do we need a nationwide lockdown? We ideally, what evidence was there for is to contain it in the places where it is occurring. Now the question is, we did not have the ability to contain it in that small scale. We did not trust our own systems enough, and rightly so. We did not have the, for example, if you see Kerala's response, the way panchayats in Kerala have taken a responsibility not only on the outbreak response and containment, but also on reducing stigma and various other aspects, on ensuring food distribution, on making the effects of the lockdown more just and fair. That ability was not there at a national scale, and hence we had to mount a nationwide lockdown. Now we have realized that the cost of maintaining a nationwide lockdown is almost overcoming the benefits that it is giving us from the pandemic. Clearly, with the amount of chaos and economic chaos, as well as various other problems it has caused. So I would argue that in the coming weeks, months, and years, our ability to decentralize our response, our ability to work in small villages and primary health centers and panchayats needs to improve. And I don't think we should even start thinking on, oh, how can we cope with living in lockdown for months together? We should not cope with that kind of a situation, because I think we shouldn't allow that to arise.
Okay. All right. So, talking about rural India, you said that it's not infected, but it is affected. Could you talk a bit more about how like other health indicators have been impacted as a result of the lockdown?
So indicators as such, I wish I could give you numbers of how this affects that. That will come and it will take time, I think. I will not be able to share numbers. Qualitatively, I can comment, like I said, on, take for example, maternal health. Yeah, I mean, we live in a country still where access to safe delivery is problematic in many parts of the country. By safe, first is just the medical safety. Forget the perception and feeling of comfort and safety for mothers to be delivering in a facility where they feel comfortable. That's still very far away. If you are talking of, so I'm still talking of safety in terms of a facility where infection practices, skilled birth attendant is available, and the baby can be resuscitated as soon as it is born in case it needs, these kind of things. So with, and for many of these people, the complete lack of public transport, the ability to leverage relatives. So in a system where formal and social support does not exist, the only resource that people have is relatives, and uncles who are available on a phone call. They are not available anymore. They have to get the passes and permit letters, and they have to trigger their social networks to gather these. So there is definitely going to be a huge effect on maternal health, on immunization, for example. Thankfully, Kerala was the first state to restart immunization. Many other states are following suit. There will be definitely huge effects on people with chronic care. Epileptics, for example, require medicines every month. In our own hospital nearby, where me and my wife do some clinical work, we've had children with type 1 diabetes who've had huge difficulties in obtaining insulin. So I mean, it's just a very large number of disruptions that are occurring. Yes, there are a lot of wonderful people who are helping out, and we see those stories on Twitter, Facebook, newspapers, etc. But that cannot be a sustainable solution. We cannot sustain on the benevolence of strangers. Systems ought to work. I mean, charity and benevolence can only go so far. And in that sense, I think we need to start moving towards thinking better of how we can make healthcare and social systems work at multiple levels.
Okay, so when you also talk about preparedness, a lot of maybe not health itself, but things like micronutrient supplementation, for instance, a lot of service delivery actually depends on line departments. So could you talk a bit about convergence, between, say, Ministry of Health or, Ministry of Women, Child, also the Department of Education, how are systems, these other line departments reacting now to solve issues to do with health?
I can't speak again. Like I said, I can't speak for the how it is. And I mean, Indian states are so diverse. I mean, from one state to another, there's a lot of difference in how. I can just say that in general terms, convergence is actually much better at lower levels than it is at higher levels. To get the central government Ministry of Health and the central government Ministry of Education to work together is going to be so much more difficult than getting the school teacher here and the ASHA and the doctor to have a conversation on COVID-19. The problem is that we have not been, I feel the problem is that we have looked at convergence always as flowing from above. So convergence by circular, like government order. So you have an order saying you will have this meeting twice a month kind of thing. So somehow we have not been able to have a kind of a more bottom-up convergence on many of these sectors and initiatives. I don't know. I mean, again, like I said, it's beyond the scope of this discussion. There's a lot we can talk about the need for convergence and possibly how it ought to be achieved. but it would, if we are able to achieve convergence, it would benefit not only the COVID-19 response, but various others. Just last week, I was in a group that was discussing what is called as One Health or planetary health. One Health is this framework which tries to ask doctors, ecologists, and veterinarians to work together in surveilling diseases, in being better prepared for zoonotic diseases. Take Nipah virus, for example, and various other diseases, Ebola, for example, even COVID-19, for example, which probably spilt over into humans from cycling in other wild or domesticated animals. So even in One Health, the discussion is about convergence. How do you get these multiple disciplines and sectors to work together? And there too, so if we are able to move towards convergence, there will be wins across multiple issues. Yeah, it's $1 million question on how to achieve better convergence.
Okay, so okay, we have another question on the robustness of data collection related to health in India. And how is the government really positioned to gather this data and use it in the middle of a pandemic? Yeah.
The robustness is not there. I mean, a few days back on Twitter, I was engaging with various handles that were trying to ask for better data on the denominator, on the deaths. So, I mean, many people are puzzled, why is India having such a much lesser mortality than elsewhere? And that has led to all sorts of I would characterize them as falsehoods currently, that okay, the Indian strain is less virulent, or Indians have some kind of better immunity, or etc. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are not having a robust system of deaths registration, not even birth registration, but birth registration is slightly better off. The way I mean, there are a lot of elderly people in rural areas that quietly pass on, and there is often not enough wealth or incomes in these families for them to organize a death certificate, or obtain a cause of death. Funerals happen in open fields. There is no specific system, and many of these things completely go unreported. So potentially, for example, if there are many elderly deaths happening in small villages and elsewhere, we might not be recording them, because a lot of our data on COVID-19, which is being reported on the COVID-19 dashboard, is hospital deaths. Many of these COVID-19 certified deaths are all hospital deaths. So we don't know. I'm not suggesting that I'm not saying that, oh, there are a lot of people dying outside hospitals or something like that, but we don't know. That's the big answer. And we have not made our systems good enough. You talk of data journalism, where journalists are doing exemplary work in bringing out new analyses based on open data, but we don't have that kind of an open data in India. About 8-9 years back, I had led an RTI campaign where and I've written a few articles about it, where I had asked through RTIs two districts. I chose random districts in India, a few in Gujarat, few in Andhra Pradesh, few in Kerala, few in Karnataka. And I said, okay, in the last year, can you tell me how many people died of tuberculosis, and how many people died of cancer, and how many people died of 3 conditions I picked, and my logic was, if you are a district health officer, this would be the premise for you to allocate resources to run your district. And they all said, sorry, this we don't know, because we are totaling it and we are sending it. So all of these are there in some kind of PDF reports that are collated and put up like we used to do things 100 years ago. There's no disaggregation. There is no way in which data is presented in a way that researchers and journalists can make sense of it. So we have a long way to go in terms of making our births and deaths registration systems better.
So someone also wants to know, by how much do you think cases and deaths are being undercounted, and is there government suppression of data?
First is, by how much? I would be misleading you if I give you a number, because this is an unknown unknown. in those quadrants of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. This is an unknown unknown. So it would be hazardous for me to say, yeah, it may be 40% or 80%. There is completely no basis for us to be able to attach a number. If you ask me how confident I am that there is a lot of missing data, that I'm very confident. I would say near 100% confidence. But if you say how much of it is missing, it's very difficult for any one person to know, I think. And the only way, I mean, if you would push for, I don't know, we've already spent so long. I don't know how many of you are still in in the mood for more gyan, but there are ways. We can do something like called zero surveillance, where we randomly choose populations and look for evidence of past infection. For example, I don't remember the exact number, but there are several tens of districts which have not reported a single case yet. So zero. In fact, my district, Chamrajnagar district in southern Karnataka, is surrounded by districts which are hotspots, but my district has reported 0 cases. So we could potentially do surveys to get evidence of past infection, what is called as a antibody detection, in the community. And if we find circulating antibodies in randomly selected people, we can infer that even though we have not detected 0 at the central level, the infection is there in the community. How could this be the case? This could be the case because, one, there are many asymptomatic carriers. And for many people, like I said before, they get an infection and they throw it off like a regular flu. And most importantly, right now, the stigma for reporting a relatively minor cold or a cough is quite high. So imagine I'm a very poor daily wage worker. I'm getting my rations and I start developing a minor cough. I think it's likely I might hide it than to start saying, I need to report it, etc. Because I just don't know. I'm just scared of what might happen, etc. Various reasons are there. So to cut a long story short, I think we are not doing that kind of work. Unfortunately, we are not doing that kind of zero surveillance and things like that. So it's very difficult to answer that question. Suppression of data. Is the Indian government suppressing data? I don't know. I do not have any direct information. I can speak in general terms. I think governments do suppress data, as many of you will agree, for various reasons. And I think I'm not endorsing it, certainly not endorsing it, but I think we can operate under the assumption that all of the data that we need is not publicly available. It ought to be, and I don't know whether there is an active suppression of data, and I hope that's not the case. I mean, all of this apart, we have seen exemplary leadership that I think we should acknowledge. One is the WHO. I don't know how many of you noticed all of these various conspiracy theories, largely I think coming from the United States with their particular sort of interest in bringing down the stature of the WHO. So the WHO has shown enormous leadership in this epidemic, and WHO is an example of a global public good. It's equivalent to us having a public service in India at a global level. Second is within governments in India, I think there are a lot of specific individuals who have shown leadership. I wish Kerala, for example, has been spoken about enormously. And I think it's not one person there, but the entire system, which is benefiting from decades of investment in public health and and decentralization. So there is a lot of positives also. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, since you brought up social stigma related to in the context of social distancing, could you also share your views on communalization of narratives around social distancing?
Yeah, so I think this speaks to the part about how illnesses and disease have as much a social origin as much as they do a biomedical origin, and I think it's extremely dangerous for us to be in a place where we start attributing danger or danger from the infection to one identity, because very clearly the virus will spread from anyone to anyone. And I think what seems, I mean, I feel what seems to have happened is that we live in times where there has already been a hugely divisive narrative on many topics, and sadly COVID-19 merely played into that context. So then the divisive narrative continued to also invade the COVID-19 space, like it has various other aspects of our life. And I think it's very unfortunate, and we must, I think, be it as health workers, be it as um, anyone who is benefited from public services of various kinds, we must do something in our own ways to ensure that we decommunalize, destigmatize this kind of a narrative. Um, for example, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of communalization of narratives that we are seeing on social media, and I think it's extremely important that we do our best in combating that. What can we do? What can we do is, I think, first we certainly need to listen, and we need to be able to uh, give good quality information on many of the people who are spreading these kind of narratives are doing it on the basis of half truths to spread a specific agenda that they might have, and the only way to fight that is through good quality information and dialogue. Then that's, to some extent, that's what I've been trying to do on with my own group of friends, on WhatsApp groups, on family groups and things like that, because communalization of narrative at a public social media and societal level will have antecedents and origins in much smaller groups, and in all our own small group WhatsApp groups or peer groups, we'll have small origins of these, and that is where I think we need to engage, dialogue, patiently listen, and try to address this.
So there's a question here that there are reports that hospitals in Ahmedabad are segregating wards, especially, and they're not admitting Muslim patients. I mean, are there checks and balances in place to ensure that this kind of segregation doesn't happen within the system itself?
That's completely unacceptable, and I think I mean, I don't know what kind of sanction has been made in this specific instance. I don't know about the specific instance, but it's completely unacceptable, even if you look at it from a completely medical point of view. Forget politics and everything else. That kind of segregation by any kind of identity has no medical basis. It certainly does not have any humanitarian basis, and I think that's a very slippery slope to go under. Even if you find someone making arguments, medical arguments for this kind of thing, remember that when we support any exclusion based on an identity, the circle comes back very quickly. One day the person supporting such exclusion based on identity will find himself or herself in this situation, and unfortunately it will be too late for them to realize what they have been supporting. So anyway, I mean, I think there is no sanction for anything like that anywhere, and I don't think anyone would agree to have that kind of segregation.
When we talk about dealing with stigma, I mean, how well equipped are public health systems, to deal with, how well equipped are they to deal with offering psychosocial support? So we've heard some successes from Kerala, for instance, where SHG women were involved in providing counseling services. But what about the other states?
I don't know about all the states, but certainly this is very fledgling, I would say. It's very early. Unfortunately, our public services have not yet enormously prepared themselves for the kind of inclusiveness we need in these kind of situations. Forget COVID-19. Irrespective of COVID-19, we already live in a very stratified kind of societies. In some places less, some places more. Kerala is too exceptional, unfortunately, because of the very large diversity that state has in terms of along various axes, be it religion, be it caste, be it socioeconomic position, be it gender, various things. And Kerala, many people have also highlighted problems too with Kerala. So if you leave Kerala aside, many of the other public services, not only health, we have a long way to go in terms of first problematizing this, accepting that this is a problem. And I think, unfortunately, like if I see on social media and in many peer groups, acceptance of the problem is still limited. Acceptance that we are stratified along various axes of inequalities in our society is less, and therein lies the problem. Because if we don't, what we don't accept, we will not address. So, and yeah, I mean, so that's maybe, I mean, that's partly the more theoretical answer to what you asked. Practically speaking, I think as individuals, I have met many exemplary health workers who as individuals are very good at heart and are able to manage the kind of inclusiveness we need in our interactions. Take for example some parts of Karnataka where rural households are segregated along caste lines. I mean, you have literally streets that are named after a particular caste. And if you are a health worker, so your interactions are also heavily based on your own caste identity and the caste identity of the household who is receiving your service. So there's enormous amount of work, sensitization, as well as cultural sort of competence, sort of skills that I will need to develop in order to be able to navigate these complex exchanges in my area. Some people do it very well, some people not. Unfortunately, currently a lot of it has to depend on the individual capacity themselves. As a system, we have not started having these conversations and building competence, building cultural competence for these kind of interactions. I hope we will begin to start doing so. And I think pandemics like COVID-19 acutely exposed this divide. They have always been there. It's not like this kind of religious stigma, or saying, this religion, people if are infected with this from this religion, we will put there things. These are not coming in during COVID. These are exacerbated by COVID, and I think that's something we need to be very careful about.
So there's another question about data. It says if researchers or policymakers were to look at preparedness of an outbreak in states, what are some direct and indirect parameters that they could look at, and what are some reliable data sets? So how reliable is HMIS data, for instance?
So in terms of preparedness, I think, like I said before, two broad guidance is we have to increase detection and reduce transmission. That's broadly how we have to be looking at it. So everything that we can do to increase detection, decentralizing our testing, early picking up of cases, like in technical terms, what is called a syndromic surveillance, where anyone coming with fever-like illnesses or influenza-like, flu-like illnesses are immediately presumed to be likely COVID-19, and hence all kinds of containment, contact tracing, etc. begins early on. We immediately ensure that the person, his family members, households are immediately start practicing physical distancing. They start wearing a mask, and they are placed under quarantine, and as early as possible they are tested, and all of these precautions stick on right through for 14 days. So this, if done at the most decentralized scale, then you don't have to worry about people coming into cities and district headquarters for these things. So preparedness here would mean that the primary health center, each primary health center, and every 15 to 20 villages in the country has one government primary health center. If each of these primary health centers are trained well enough for early detection, and they have a clear protocol on what needs to be done in case they find someone with a flu-like illness presenting in their outpatient, or flagged by their ASHA or Anganwadi worker, then I think that is an indicator that we are well prepared. Now, the question is now about testing, and that's the big question. Testing is available typically only at district headquarters, yeah, and it's not increased as much as we would like it to have been increased. So testing is, and how many people we are testing, and how many people are positive among those we are testing. These are some of the other indicators that one could look at. Now, data on all of these are not available currently, save from the press briefings that state governments are giving, and I think what ICMR puts out every day on the number of tests that are being conducted. The HMIS, the Routine Health Management Information System, the HMIS data does not capture many of the COVID-19 related aspects. Where the HMIS data is useful is to track the earlier question we spoke about. What about the essential health services? What about the immunization? What about detection of mothers with anemia, TTE vaccines to mothers, tuberculosis detection? All of that data is available in the HMIS, and I think if there are sort of open data enthusiasts and volunteers, it's extremely good to already start picking a few districts and then doing a trend analysis of how the detection of antenatal cases or immunization, is it increasing, decreasing, what's happening, you know, things like that. Because the less we immunize now, you know, the more likely we might have measles outbreak, let's say a few years later. And these kind of outbreaks again further have their own inequitable distribution, more so among worse off, poorer off, more vulnerable, more remote people. Yeah.
Okay, there's one more question on how will the monsoon season, how will monsoon and outbreaks of seasonal disease such as dengue, malaria impact the ability of hospitals to treat COVID and vice versa?
Yeah, these are all, I mean, these are all very important questions, and I don't know what, I mean, we've already begun to see pre-monsoon showers, and the IMD has announced 100% or even an exceptionally good monsoon this year. And I don't know, there is going to be that spurt of malaria, dengue, chikungunya infections. These are all infections that require protracted hospitalization. And that's why I think we need to carefully exit the lockdown, and we need to start dealing with the epidemic at multiple levels in a very communitized scale, at a very grand scale. And yes, it's true that we are unprepared. I wish we could have invested much more in preparing ourselves while there was this lockdown. That would have been the best use of the lockdown. While you have a lockdown, you mount a robust response, you keep the primary health centers ready, you completely fill up the vacancies. All of that we could have done. We haven't done that because we, like I said, I think we sort of put over this blanket and we hope that the monster would go away, and we are peeking out and saying, oh, it's still there. You keep the blanket on. It won't work because all of these problems are there, and they will increase in the coming weeks to months.
There's one more question. So given that cities are places where even less virulent diseases can become lethal, what could be possible indicators on how our city should grow?
One, I mean, I cannot give you an indicator, but certainly I think one thing that I take away from this is that we cannot afford to have the kind of cheap labor that every city in India has enormously benefited from, because that kind of cheap labor on which all of our IT infrastructure and the huge beautiful malls and stuff are built literally on overpopulated and under-resourced slums, temporary settlements, etc. Earlier, I think we could look away and we could say, okay, oh, he's having a wretched life, unfortunate for him, kind of thing. Now, I think it's very clear that if we allow our cities to grow upon the backs of cheap labor and really exploitative labor practices, this is going to hit back in the form of any future outbreak, making cities even more vulnerable for everyone, and not only for the exploited people who are in these. So I think one thing for me is, I think cities need to increasingly focus on making their own public services much more friendly, much more accessible, and much more equitable. I hope this is it's not like I'm seeing clues everywhere that people are taking this lesson, but I would like this to be the lesson, that we need much more equitable and socially just cities if we have to be better prepared in future pandemics, and not the way we have now. Sorry,
now that we are
just to qualify that response, it's funny because no, it's not funny. It's ironic actually that the migrants that we are talking about are who are extremely poor, and they are the ones that, everyone is thinking of them as a big problem. Oh, there's this migrant population, they want to go home. Many of us are also migrants in some sense. I'm also not there are many people in my own institute, for example, who are from other states, etc. But they are not waiting, they're not in shelters and sitting on charity food. They're not waiting and rushing to go home. Why is that? That's only because there are some migrants who are caught in really terrible occupational jobs without any social security, with temporary hutments, very limited housing and things like that. Whereas many others who are not called migrants have done well. People in formal sector have done well. So I think the biggest thing is that we have to acknowledge that we cannot continue without occupational safety and labor safeguards in future, because that's really how our cities' urbanization has entirely been subsidized by the poor to a large extent. And now we are pretending like that's the problem. It's really rather ironic actually.
Is there a place where we can access data on where all the red, green curfew zones are?
For your city or for the country?
So maybe city-wise.
City-wise, I think all. For Bangalore, I know, for example, that the BBMP has put out very good quality maps on Twitter and Facebook and various social media. I think that many city corporations are doing that. If they are not doing that, they ought to be doing that, because geographical visualization, I think, is one of the few things that people have really leveraged during the current outbreak. And I think all municipal corporations ought to be doing that. I don't know how where it is accessible for Ahmedabad, but I hope they are going to put it out.
Okay, and one more question on, what are the challenges of a shift to decentralized containment now, and what are the risks and dangers in transition? And how capable are we of handling the situation locally?
I think the second question I'll take first. How capable are we of handling the situation locally? For me, it's the question of the imperative. We are not. The short answer to that is we are not capable of handling it locally. But I think the consequence of not being prepared locally cannot be that we deal with it nationally. We have to. So this is where we have to do our best, and it's very likely that some areas will do much better than others. It will be very clumsy. It will be chaotic. But I don't know. I might be completely wrong here. I'm far beyond my specific area of expertise now. But I'm talking more as someone who has a broad framework on what ought to guide our action. And one of the things in that broad framework is what I said earlier. The effects of the lockdown are weighing harder than the benefits that are accruing from it. Yeah, and the effects are also very unfairly distributed. So I don't think we can lock down the pandemic away. So we have to exit it. And yes, it's a good question. We may not be better, we may not be well prepared, many areas may do it very badly, but that seems to be the only way I can see, than being just continuously, like for example Karnataka has today extended its lockdown to May 15th. I'm not against lockdowns. Lockdowns work, but to have them at such high levels is, I think, difficult for many. That's what I would say. How are we on yeah, I mean, I don't know, perhaps if I was in the government, or if I was a bureaucrat, if I were an IAS officer, etc., maybe I might have had a different perspective on this, but I'm not. And I'm as a person who is not in charge of lockdowns, I find that we must find ways of adapting to local situations. We are a very diverse country, and the more things we do centrally, the less the more it affects people at the not only people at the margins, various other people. And I think the more we can do things further closer to people, the better we are able to adapt it to that local setting. That said, it's not that everything decentralized works fascinatingly well. So I mean, there might be the same problems even at a more decentralized scale. So I might live in a panchayat which is entirely taken over by, I mean, if not the panchayat office itself, the power lies entirely in men over 60 years in this village, let's say. And it's very likely that they will impose their own kind of things on the entire village, and that might affect women, or it might affect Dalits, or it might affect some other group more unfairly than others. But still, these power structures are much more accessible than a chief minister of a state or the prime minister, and that allows for a bit more negotiation at a smaller scale on the effects of containment.
All right, I think we can close on that note. Any closing remarks that you would?
Maybe just one remark I would say is that we all have to be reflexive, I think, in times of how a lot of fake news and various kinds of narratives are emerging. And we need to also be able to listen to each other, because I see that a lot of the divisiveness is also coming from the ability, from the lost ability for dialogue and discussion. So I think we need to keep reflexivity and patience and listening in mind while we deal with the pandemic. That's all from me. I hope it was useful, the interaction.